a hand came up in the hand history forum that I wanted to dive deeply into because it seems like a really interesting spot. The hero here is on the button with ace king suited. It's a 6 max tournament, and they're about 5 or 6 from the money. So the bubble pressure is extremely high in this spot, and the under the gun player opens to a min raise, and the hero here is caught between 2 big stacks and then a short stack in the big blind, and he's dealt a really strong hand, ace king suited. So the question he had was, after he called and the flop played out, if he should call or not. My initial reaction when I saw the post was, why would you have a decision on the turn when it seems like a clearly profitable spot to shove? Now, because it's the bubble, the risk of getting knocked out before the money is pretty significant. We have 30 big blinds, and there's at least 2 people who can call us and 1 who has shown he has at least some interest in the hand. But it seems to me like if we raise here, it's going to be hard for the button to call us with anything, even though he covers us by about 3 to 1. It's still 30 big blinds, and he's probably not going to want to risk too much of his stack when he's seen action from a guy who's got 2/3 of his stack and one guy who's got 1/3 of his stack. And then when it gets to the big blind, obviously he has to be even more concerned about the bubble than we are, depending on how many stacks are shorter than him. He still has 17 big blinds. If there are shorter stacks at other tables, it's really a disaster for him to give up whatever equity he has in the tournament. And then when the initial raiser is opening, he's opening into this stack here, knowing that he's going to have a ton of pressure and he can open this hand super wide. But once we shove into him, we're going to be shoving 30 big blinds. So he's going to need some pretty good hand to stand up to that raise, because my initial assumption is that if we shove, we're going to get a whole lot of folds. We're going to pick up this 1600, this 800, this 400, and this 320. If we call, there's a good chance we won't flop a pair. If we do get a flush draw and he applies a lot of pressure, we may end up calling and then folding. That we can bleed off a lot of our stack here while we still preserve our place in the tournament. It does seem like a lot of the time what's going to happen is we're going to invest 2 big blinds or maybe 6 big blinds and not even get to realize our equity on the river. So my gut is telling me that a shove is really profitable. The problem is that when we do get called, it's going to be by very strong hands, and there's a chance we're going to get knocked out. So maybe the risk versus the reward. The person who posted the question, I think, is a pretty solid player, and we came up with different intuitions about how to handle the situation. I thought it was an interesting spot to look in a little bit more deeply. So, and I looked at the 4 of the possible scenarios that are going to happen. Either the small blind calls us, the big blind calls us, the original raiser calls us, or everybody folds and we pick up all the dead money. Now there is other cases where more than one person calls us. I decided for the sake of simplicity and because they're going to be very, very rare, to ignore those cases for now. So let's take a look at this spreadsheet here. The opening bet we got was 2 big blinds, and we have 30 big blinds in our stack, and we were considering going all in. And if we do, there was 1.5 blinds from the small blind and big blind, and less than half a big blind from the antes. So you'll notice here the formulas, some things get calculated automatically. Notice that the pot size when we get called by the small blind is 63.4. We had to take out the 1/2 from his small blind. It's 2 times 30/60 plus 2 plus the big blind plus the ante, so 62.4. Notice here it's not the same as what happens if the opener calls, because his 2 big blinds are going to be absorbed into his call, so it's going to be 2 times 30/60, 61.5, 61.9. On the big blind, I have to put in mind that we have him covered, so even when we get called, we're going to have some chips left in our stack. Right now his stack is 0. I'll put in 17 for him, and you can see even if we get called and lose, we'll have 13 chips left in our stack. And then you can see up here the full probability is just going to be what happens if none of these 3 things happen. So the next thing to do is figure out for each of these cases, what do we think their ranges are, and what is our equity against that range. So for the small blind, we're shoving 30 big blinds. Even though he has everybody covered, he's probably aware that it's the bubble. Let's say that the worst hand he's going to call us with is pocket jacks. And maybe, if he's ambitious, ace king. He might throw in ace queen suited, but it'd probably be a mistake. He might throw in tens. But I feel that that's a reasonable, tight calling range for the small blind. He does have to worry about the possibility the opener also has a pair bigger than 10. So now the big blind, I think he's going to call with queens. I don't think he's going to call with jacks, and I don't think he's going to gamble with ace king suited. He's the one who can definitely bust if he goes out. If there are a number of stacks between him and the money, he's probably going to play tight and stall. The opener is going to be a little bit more work to figure out because you have to worry about his opening range and his calling range. Just going to table that for a second, and I'm going to go to these two here. I'm opening up Flopzilla as the equity calculator for this example. I initially put it in using Equilab, and I'll explain why I decided to scrap that version. So I've got as a calling range jacks plus, ace king suited, ace king offsuit. You'll see right now that's 40 combos in a preflop range, 3%. It's a very tight calling range. Where it's coming up with the 40 is that every pocket pair is 6, so that's 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6, that's 24. There's 12 combos of ace king offsuit and 4 combos of ace king suited. But since we have ace of spades, king of spades, that's going to block. It's only 3 combos of aces, 3 combos of kings, 3 combos of ace king suited. Overall, the combos go down to 27 combos in his range. And the reason I did scrap Equilab is it was not taking out the dead cards from the initial player's hand. And I wanted to make sure, because it's such a small range, this removal is going to be very important in terms of the overall math. So the range that calls us has a 57.2% equity, and our hand has 42.8%. So I'm going to put in our equity is 42.8%. And he's calling us only 2.2% of hands. Now when we get to the big blind, that's even tighter. We're going to take out everything except for queens. You can see he's only calling 0.98%, and his equity is, our equity drops because we don't get to flip against jacks, and we don't tie with ace king. So I'll put in our equity is 34.6%, and he calls basically 1% of the time. You can notice here that the probability that both of these two together fold is about 3%, and so 97% of the time, right now this is checking out. Look at what range the opener might be opening with. He is in a fairly good spot overall, having 2 of the 3 people covered near the bubble. He does have to worry about the small blind, who's the big stack at the table, but because he can put so much pressure on the big blind, I'm going to assume he's going to open a lot of pocket pairs, lots of suited hands. Oh, not all the suited hands though. So let's take out some of the worst suited hands here and put in some broadways. Now in practice, he might want to raise more big hands because it's going to be because he's not really going to be playing that much post flop if it's going to be shove or fold. So he may want instead to have high card equity to block the potential of one of the opponents having high cards that they can re-raise. There is some chance that the small blind will just call and play a pot with him since they're both pretty deep. So maybe he'll want to have those suited hands in his range. So right now I've got about 341 combos in his pre-flop range when we take out our ace and king. That's a 30% opening range. He might actually go wider than that, but for the sake of argument, let's stop there. So we put in 341 total combos. That way we can help calculate the fold equity. Now when we shove, I'm just going to look at the odds he's going to face. So he needs to have 45% equity against our shoving range, which is going to be a pretty tight shoving range. He may have some kind of sunk cost problem, where he's going to say, well, I can't fold a pair. So he's going to call us maybe a little wider than everyone else, but he still has to fold a whole bunch. Let me just wipe it out and start over. So obviously not folding aces or kings, probably not folding queens, probably not folding ace kings. He may dip down into a few more pairs. When he does, it's a higher chance that we're going to bust, which is not great, but at least we're not running terrible against those hands. Let's throw in nines and ace queen suited. Have one hand that we dominate. 42 combos in his pre-flop range that he's calling with. So if he's calling with 42 combos, that means that he's calling 12% of the time. That means he's folding 88% of the hands that he's opened. Now we can adjust later on and say, well, what if he's not opening quite that wide? What if he's not calling quite that wide? And that's why I put it in a spreadsheet, so I can run different variations on the scenario here. And then our equity against the calling range we've got, it's not that bad. It's 46% of the time we're going to win. It should be the highest equity of the three because it's the loosest calling range of the three. Okay, so when we put that in, we're going to get 46% of this 62 big blind pot, so a little bit under half, about 28.47. But he's only calling 12% of the time, so now notice 85% of the time our shove is getting through and nobody's calling us. And so 85% of our stack when everybody folds is 28.75. Add all those together, we get that our total equity is 33.02, and we've added 3 big blinds to our stack by shoving. That's a 10% increase in our stack. Seems like there's very few opportunities to increase your stack by 10% with the play. So I'm inclined to say that this is a good shove. Now the reason that the player didn't shove and who posed the question initially is that there's a chance that he gets called and busts. So let's take a look at how often that happens. Right now we have the small blind calling 2% of the time and winning 57% of that. So that's 1.3% of the time he busts us. And we have the opener and the cutoff calling 12% of the time and winning 54% of the time. So that's 6.5% of the time he's going to call and bust us. So overall, there's a 7.7% chance that this hand makes us bubble, given those ranges. We are going to call and double some of the time. There's about a 7% chance that we actually double our stack, and we'll have a much bigger stack on the bubble. We'll have, if we double up through this guy, we'll have the whole table covered. If we double up through this guy, we'll have 60, and the guy who's in the small blind now will have 70. So there are definitely some advantages to taking the risk here, and they're about even. It's about even that we're going to call and bust, and even that we're going to call and double. Now, calling and busting is definitely more detrimental than calling and winning is profitable, but it does increase our chances of making a deep run in the tournament when we call and double up. Now, some things that might affect this is we can say, well, what if the opener doesn't call quite that often? And that reduces our chances of calling and busting. It also is probably going to reduce our overall equity in the hand. So let's go back quickly and say, well, let's take out 9s, 10s, ace queen suited. That gets his calling range back to 2.2%, which is 27 combos. That's the same calling range we had for the small blind. That brings the call probability down to 8%, and since it's the same calling range as the small blind, we have the same equity. And overall, you can see it's still about a 3 big blind change, so it didn't change that much by taking those few hands out. But it did reduce the possibility that we bust to 6% and the possibility that we double to under 5%. So it's not surprising that this is a very profitable shove in a vacuum, but because we're on the bubble, we do need to be concerned about the risk of busting. We do have a in this situation, somewhere to between 5 and 6% chance of busting, which definitely not zero, and a reason to be a little concerned. So I thought that the software that would be best used to analyze the bubble pressure of the situation would be ICMizer. Now, I didn't know how many other tables were in the tournament, how likely it was that we could fold our way to at least a min cash. So I used what I think is one of the more stringent bubbles, 9 max turbo here, where fourth place gets nothing, third place gets 20%, second gets 30%, and first gets 50%. And then I just put in the stack sizes here. So he had 50 big blinds, he had almost 100 big blinds, he had 17 big blinds, we had 30 big blinds, and we have the cutoff raising 2 big blinds. We've got ace king suited here, and let's just see what we think a profitable shoving range should be. Is ace king suited profitable enough that we can disregard the concern about busting, and what are the worst hands that we can shove with in this situation? And you'll notice that it has ace king suited as a 7200 chip push, which is this case the big blinds I put in were 2K, so it's 3.5 big blinds. My estimate was three big blinds. It's got a 3.5. That's pretty close. And you can see that some of these pairs here are gonna still be profitable. Let's make the min threshold. Let's say we want to win 2 big blinds or better. And I'll toss, well, 9s plus, ace queen suited, ace king offsuit. Those are still going to be profitable even at 2 big blinds or better. This is not a perfect analogy to the tournament situation. One thing you can see here is that the big blind, or ICMizer has it calling at 8% of the time, which is much, much wider than we had in our estimate. And that's because when there's only 4 people left and only 3 people paid, you can't wait for someone else to bubble out, so you need to take more chances. So it also has the small blind calling a lot more often than we had in our example. So the small blind calling would increase the risk of us busting. It also increases the probability of us doubling, because every hand that he adds to his range, ace king suited is doing pretty decent against, and some that it's dominating. So overall, I do think that it was a clear shove before the flop, but it was definitely worth diving in and looking in the details under the hood to see why. I just feel like if we do call, it gives the small blind so much incentive to put the squeeze on us. And I'd rather make one mistake in a hand than 2 or 3 or 4. So sometimes the brute force method, to me, is the best method.